The following is a look at the killers of Dead by Daylight, and any real-world equivalents they might have. Let's continue. Adriana Imei, aka the Skull Merchant. It's quite hard to talk about the killer of the infamous Tools of Torment chapter without addressing the elephant in the room. The elephant with severe eczema and flatulence. Tools of Torment is easily the least popular DLC that's ever been released for this game, and in my view, for good reason. The power was awful, the characters were lame, and oh dear did it suck. With that out of the way, let's take a look at the lore. Born in Brazil to Japanese parents, Adriana Imei was said to be bright from a young age, with her only issue being that she was too competitive. It isn't clear where this hostile streak comes from. She has nothing to prove, her parents seem adjusted, and she doesn't have to perform conditionally like some of the other killers. After a bit of trouble in private school, another student named Joao took the lead off her academically. It isn't clear how, something to do with money, I don't know. I do know Adriana then stalked the poor boy and planned some nasty surprises for him, but she never went the whole way. The tome talks about the hunting style and how easily she got his address.
Fuck you.
Whiskey?
Her family were struggling financially, so Adriana made money via online manga and exploiting the nerds that apparently worked for free. I can't help but feel behaviour's trying to tell us something. Anyway, this got her some money. However, out of the blue, the father abandoned the family. I have a feeling we'll find out why at some point, but this was a left turn for the plot. Adriana got to work to make even more money, buying and selling whole companies and cutting costs where she could. She showed patterns of being highly exploitative and only caring about short-term wealth. In any case, she did very well for herself and was a millionaire at the tender age of 18. Now, I'm going to expose my true lack of knowledge in this particular field, as the information I do have is contradictory. On the one hand, psychopaths are less successful because they ruin everything. However, psychopaths are more successful because they ruin everything. I suppose it depends on what you consider success, and that is a massive can of wasps. Robert Hare is of the view that psychopathy is overrepresented amongst CEOs and other high rollers of society, but I've not read Snakes in Suits yet. It's on the wish list. It does make sense that being callous and unemotional would grant a competitive edge in certain fields within capitalism. I can only assume this is the secret of Adriana's indomitable drive. But this is an aspect of pop psychopathy I find appalling. That the psychopathic are indirectly glamorized as go-getters, and their negative traits are overlooked or even exalted. We've all met regular people who would regard traits such as pity, compassion, forgiveness, even basic empathy as weaknesses that need to be purged. I really don't agree with this. But it's a sad fact that this is a tough world and getting tougher. This minority of more cutthroat people will occupy both extremes in society. I'm going to skip over unpacking loaded terms such as world versus society, as well as civilization, nature, and soul. These topics are far too weighty and complicated. Yet there's no denying our society rewards psychopathic and narcissistic behaviour, and both of these attributes are on the rise, and have been for a while. Yes, wider society punishes these traits as well, but being selective to context has made it so the psychopathic have taken over in certain fields. This never ends well. All I can do is plead to anyone who will listen, don't give these people positions of power. It will be the death of us all. In fact, it might already be our doom. And we've seen it in the personalities of various killers featured in this game. But what about serial killers? How successful are most of them? Well, most of them are normal to below average to complete losers and lower. Some are middle class, but a stark minority is indeed successful despite humble beginnings. John Wayne Gacy made a name for himself and ran with some very powerful people, and Todd Kohlhepp also had a successful business despite being a registered sex offender. However, these two weren't part of my project, the former having too much information and being something of a myth, and the latter being comparatively too recent. Unable to think of a serial killer that compared to Adriana, I double-checked my project, and the closest I found was Herb Baumeister. He founded the Save-A-Lot thrift store chain in Indianapolis in 1988. That's hardly Skull Merchant's level, but an accomplished serial killer with a good work ethic is rare. At least the ones that get caught. And both Skull Merchant and Baumeister have little else in common. Baumeister was schizophrenic as well as suffering from antisocial personality disorder, but I do remember he liked to urinate on things. So, given Scully is a territory control killer, there's at least some evidence she could have been even worse. Maybe. But I won't talk about her power yet, and I need to remind myself that a psychopath isn't necessarily a serial killer. Luckily for us, only a tiny minority of psychopaths go that far. I think to judge a serial killer by how successful they are would only conjure up the likes of John Edward Robinson or Charles Sabrage, who conned and killed their way into a small fortune. And to be fair to Adriana, she hasn't killed anyone yet. But after reading her father's final manga, she adopted the persona of the titular character, the Skull Merchant. She became this character almost as if it were an alter ego. I don't know what this says about her mental state, or her motives outside of obsessively being the best. Maybe she was somewhat schizophrenic as well. Perhaps she brought her father's story to life to honour him. But I don't think he'd be too honoured with all the murdering, hun. I still don't understand this character. Why be that competitive? Does she feel she has no innate value, and thus puts too much stock in the external? That she needs to be good at something to not feel awful? I think that might hit a bit close to home for some of us. She wound up killing 2 business associates, and there were other victims to her technology and ruthless bloodlust. It's said she didn't target the weak. This makes her a non-predatory type. Predators always target the weak, hence why prostitutes and gay men are the most common targets for predatory murderers. But not all serial killers operated like this. Joseph DeAngelo targeted middle-class people for the challenge, and some serial killers were largely indiscriminate. But I want to strike against glamorizing the predatory. The lion doesn't go after the fastest and strongest zebra. They target the weakest. That's what it means to be a predator. So what does this make Skull Merchants? Well, a murderer is still a murderer regardless of their target status. But I've become convinced I'm looking in completely the wrong place. I mentioned the corporate psychopath in contrast to the failure psychopath before. So I look at the likes of Elizabeth Holmes or Bernie Madoff. Elizabeth Holmes, besides staring directly into your soul, had a company that was ultimately a fraud, and Bernie Madoff is responsible for the worst Ponzi scheme in American history and made off with billions. So, Adriana is this, but with tech and cruelty? Did she design these drones? Where did she get the skulls in the first place? Her last kill got a bit messy, and she wound up with witnesses she'd have to chase down before being recruited by the entity, who presumably feels more conned than the victims of Holmes and Madoff. This character tries so hard to be cool, but just isn't. Again, Todd Kohlhepp comes to mind, a man who'd leave Amazon reviews of products he used in his murders and kidnappings. Everyone thought they were a joke until we learnt it wasn't a joke. Not cool at all. In my final notes, I remember Tatsumo Miyazaki, who was nicknamed the Otaku Killer because of his obsession with manga and anime and the like, thus triggering a moral panic about these things. But I am sick of talking about this guy. He taunted the families of his young victims. It's a special kind of evil, as Skull Merchant is also special. The Skull Merchant's power is... I don't really know. I don't understand it. She has many elements of different types of killer. She puts her drones down about the map and they scan for survivors and tell her their location. And she gets buffs from this, and if a survivor gets scanned too much, they get wounded and broken. I hear back in the day it wasn't broken but exposed, thus making insta-downs a very real problem. I'd very much quit DBD back then, for real, no seriously, never again, and when I heard about this, and oh man did I hear about this, I didn't really want to come back. Even today I find players disconnecting en masse when they find out who the killer is. She used to be the 3-gen queen, making matches an impossible stalemate. But these days, killers can only kick gens a set number of times before the gen becomes blocked. I'm sure Scully had a hand in provoking that, as well as many other things, really. Quality speaks for itself, whereas a bad product will get spoken about a lot more by others. It's telling I never heard much about Project W besides players whining about how many people played as Wesker. Tools of Torment was just a complete mess, and it was inconsistent and trying too hard to be hip and rad. See, she uses skulls for drones because skulls are a symbol for mortality. This is silly. It belongs in a manga. Today, though, she's alright. That's about it, really.